For days after the shocking revelation, Kemi isolated herself in her small apartment. She ignored calls and messages from her family, unable to face the reality of what had happened. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of shame. As she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Kemi's hand often drifted to her stomach. The child growing inside her was a constant reminder of the impossible situation she found herself in. How could she bring a child into the world under these circumstances? But how could she not? On the fourth day of her self-imposed isolation, a knock on her door startled her out of her daze. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but something told her she needed to answer. When she opened the door, she found Ken standing there, looking as haggard and worn as she felt. "Kemi," he said, his voice hoarse. "Please, can we talk?" Every instinct told her to slam the door in his face, but instead, she found herself stepping aside to let him in. They sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, neither knowing how to begin. Finally, Ken spoke. "I'm so sorry, Kemi," he said, his eyes brimming with tears. "I never meant for any of this to happen. When I found out we were siblings, I panicked. I didn't know what to do, so I ran. It was cowardly, I know, but I was scared and confused." Kemi listened, her own emotions a tumultuous mix of anger and understanding. "Do you have any idea what I've been going through?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thinking you had just used me and left, and then finding out I was pregnant." Ken flinched at her words. "I can't even imagine," he said. "Kemi, I want you to know that my feelings for you were real. Are real. I know it's wrong, and impossible, but I can't just turn them off." Kemi felt a pang in her chest at his words. Despite everything, a part of her still cared for Ken too. But now, those feelings were tainted by the knowledge of the true relationship. "What are we going to do?" she asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her for days. Ken shook his head helplessly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever you decide about the baby, I'll support you. You don't have to go through this alone." His words, meant to comfort, only served to highlight the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just about them anymore. There was an innocent life to consider. "I need time to think," Kemi said. It's too much." Ken nodded, standing to leave. At the door, he paused. "Kemi, no matter what happens, you're my sister. I know it's strange and complicated, but you're family. We'll figure this out together." After he left, Kemi broke down in tears. The weight of her decisions felt overwhelming. The next day, gathering all her courage, Kemi decided to visit her mother. She needed guidance, and despite the complicated relationship, she knew her mother would offer support. Mrs. Adeyemi welcomed her with open arms, pulling Kemi into a tight embrace as soon as she arrived. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've been so worried about you." As they sat in the kitchen, sipping tea, Kemi poured out her heart to her mother. She shared her fears about the pregnancy, her conflicted feelings for Ken, and her anger towards their father. Mrs. Adeyemi listened patiently, offering comfort where she could. When Kemi finished, her mother took a deep breath. "Kemi, what happened is not your fault," she said firmly. "Nor is it Ken's. The blame lies with your father and me. We should have been honest with you both from the beginning." Kemi looked at her mother in surprise. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Adeyemi sighed. "When your father left, I was so angry and hurt. I wanted to protect you girls from the pain, so I never told you about Ken. I thought it would be easier if you believed your father had simply abandoned us, rather than knowing he had started a new family." Kemi felt a fresh wave of anger. "You had no right to keep that from us," she said. "We deserve to know the truth." "You're right," her mother agreed. "And I'm sorry. I thought I was doing what was best, but I was wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of years of secrets hanging between them. "What should I do, Mama?" Kemi asked, feeling like a lost child. "About the baby." Mrs. Adeyemi reached out, taking Kemi's hand in hers. "That decision is yours to make, my love. But know this, whatever you choose, you have my full support." This child, should you decide to have it, will be loved. It's not to blame for the circumstances of its conception. Kemi felt a small weight lift from her shoulders at her mother's words. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she felt a glimmer of hope. Over the next few weeks, Kemi grappled with her decision. She spoke with Ken regularly, trying to navigate their new reality as siblings while dealing with the lingering feelings from their romantic relationship. It was confusing and often painful, but slowly, they began to forge a new kind of bond. She also began to reconnect with her father, though these interactions were fraught with tension and unresolved anger. He tried to explain his reasons for leaving, for starting a new family, but Kemi found it hard to forgive the years of absence and pain. As her pregnancy progressed, Kemi found herself leaning towards keeping the baby. Despite the complicated circumstances, she had already begun to love the life growing inside her. The thought of raising a child born of such an unusual situation was daunting, but with her family's support, she felt she could do it. However, the decision wasn't without its challenges. Kemi worried about the child's health, given the close genetic relationship between her and Ken. She consulted with doctors, who advised genetic counseling and close monitoring throughout the pregnancy. There was also the question of what to tell the child about its parentage. How could they explain such a complex situation to a young child? And what about when the child grew older and began to understand the implications? These questions weighed heavily on Kemi's mind as she approached her second trimester. She knew that whatever decision she made would have lifelong consequences, not just for her, but for her entire family. One evening, as she sat on her small balcony watching the sun set over Lagos, Kemi felt a flutter in her stomach. It was the first time she had felt the baby move. In that moment, a sense of calm washed over her. She realized that despite all the complications and challenges, this child was a part of her. It was innocent, untouched by the mistakes and secrets of the past. With tears in her eyes, Kemi made her decision. She would have this baby. She would love it, protect it, and give it the best life she could. It wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to break the cycle of secrets and abandonment that had defined her own childhood. The next day, Kemi called a family meeting. As she looked at the faces of her mother, father, Ken, and Lola gathered in her mother's living room, she took a deep breath. "I've made my decision," she announced, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm going to have the baby." The room erupted in a mix of reactions. Her mother rushed to hug her, tears streaming down her face. Lola looked shocked but offered a small smile of support. Her father sat in stunned silence. Ken met her eyes across the room, his expression a complex mix of emotions. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. Kemi nodded. "I'm sure. It won't be easy, but this child deserves a chance at life. And we, all of us, we're family. Complicated and messy, but family nonetheless. We'll figure this out together." As her family gathered around her, offering words of support and love, Kemi felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in months, she felt hope for the future. Little did she know, there were still more surprises and challenges waiting just around the corner. As Kemi's pregnancy progressed, the family dynamics slowly began to shift. The initial shock and horror of the situation gave way to a cautious acceptance. They all realized that regardless of how it came to be, an innocent child was coming into their lives. Kemi's relationship with Ken evolved into a strange blend of sibling affection and co-parenting preparation. They attended doctor's appointments together, researched childcare options, and had long, sometimes awkward conversations about how they would explain their situation to their child in the future. One particularly memorable day, as they left a prenatal checkup, Ken turned to Kemi with a serious expression. "Kemi," he said, his voice low, "I've been thinking. When the baby is born, what name should it have? Mine or yours?" The question caught Kemi off guard. She hadn't even considered this aspect yet. I don't know," she admitted. "What do you think?" Ken sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, I think it should have your name. You're the one carrying this child. You're the one who will be its primary caregiver." And, he hesitated, given the circumstances, it might be easier for the child if it's not immediately associated with me as the father. Kemi nodded slowly, understanding the logic but feeling a twinge of sadness for Ken. Despite everything, he was trying his best to do right by their child. We don't have to decide right now, she said gently. Let's give it some more thought. As her due date approached, Kemi found herself growing closer to her father. Their relationship was still strained, but his efforts to make amends seemed genuine. He attended family gatherings, offered financial support for the baby, and even started to share stories about his own childhood, stories that helped Kemi understand him a little better. One evening, as they sat on the porch of her mother's house, her father turned to her with tears in his eyes. "Kemi," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "I know I can never make up for the years I wasn't there. But I want you to know how proud I am of you. The strength you've shown, the love you have for this child, you're an incredible woman." Kemi felt her own eyes well up with tears. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. As Kemi entered her 8th month of pregnancy, life threw another curveball their way. Late one night, she received a frantic call from Ken. "Kemi," he said, his voice shaking, "I need to tell you something. I just found out. I'm not actually our father's biological son." Kemi felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. "What? How is that possible?" Ken explained that he had recently done a DNA test out of curiosity about his heritage. The results had shown that the man they knew as their father couldn't possibly be his biological father. "I confronted my mother," Ken said. "She broke down and admitted that she had a brief affair before marrying our father. He never knew." The implications of this revelation were staggering. Ken and Kemi weren't biologically related at all. The baby Kemi was carrying wasn't the product of an incestuous relationship. The news sent shockwaves through the family. Their father was devastated to learn that Ken, the son he had raised, wasn't biologically his. Ken struggled with his own identity crisis. And Kemi didn't know how to feel. On one hand, the news lifted a huge weight off her shoulders. The health concerns for the baby, the societal stigma they had been dreading, those were no longer issues. But on the other hand, it meant that the entire painful ordeal they had gone through over the past months had been based on a lie. As the family grappled with this new information, Kemi went into labor 2 weeks early. The delivery was long and difficult, but finally, in the early hours of the morning, Kemi gave birth to a healthy baby girl. As she held her daughter for the first time, looking into her tiny face, Kemi felt an overwhelming surge of love. In that moment, all the complications, all the family drama, all the pain of the past year faded away. This little life in her arms was all that mattered. Ken was the first to visit them in the hospital. He stood awkwardly by the bed, looking down at the baby with a mix of awe and uncertainty. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "What are you going to name her?" Kemi smiled tiredly. "I was thinking, Hope, because despite everything, she represents hope for our future." Ken nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Hope, it's perfect." Over the next few weeks, as Kemi adjusted to motherhood, the family began to heal. The truth about Ken's parentage, while painful, had cleared the air of the suffocating secret that had haunted them. Their father, after some soul-searching, realized that biology didn't negate the years he had spent raising Ken as his son. Ken himself found a new sense of identity, separate from the family drama that had defined the past year. As for Kemi and Ken, they found themselves navigating yet another shift in their relationship. The romantic feelings they had once shared had been tempered by the months of believing they were siblings, and then further complicated by the revelation that they weren't related at all. They agreed to focus on co-parenting Hope, leaving the door open for their relationship to evolve naturally over time. 1 year after Hope's birth, the entire family gathered to celebrate her first birthday. As Kemi looked around at the smiling faces, her mother, her father, Ken, Lola, and little Hope toddling between them all, she marveled at how far they had come. The journey had been painful, filled with secrets, lies, and unimaginable twists. But it had also brought them together in ways they never could have anticipated. They had faced their past, confronted hard truths, and come out stronger on the other side. As Hope blew out her single candle, with a lot of help from Kemi realized that the title of her story had changed. It was no longer about meeting someone on Facebook and being abandoned. It was about family, forgiveness, and the unexpected paths that lead us to where we're meant to be. Looking down at her daughter, Kemi whispered, "Happy birthday, Hope. Your story is just beginning, and what a story it will be." And as the family cheered and Hope giggled, Kemi knew that whatever challenges the future held, they would face them together, as the unconventional, imperfect, but loving family they had become.